What happens when a single moment of casual cruelty shatters a life? For Oriana Parker, a 24-year-old waitress drowning in debt and despair, it was the night a billionaire decided to make her his personal punching bag in a restaurant full of staring eyes. But this isn't a story about victimhood. It's about what happened next. Because the following morning, that same titan of industry, Miles Radcliffe, stood trembling on her doorstep, not with threats, but with the keys to a $500,000 Rolls-Royce and a handwritten note of just 2 words. This is the story of that night, that morning, and how an act of public humiliation became the strange and painful beginning of an impossible redemption. The air in Le Ciel was an expensive perfume, a carefully calibrated blend of roasted duck fat, truffle oil, and old money. From her station by the swinging kitchen doors, Oriana Parker could see the city of Westport, glittering below a carpet of diamonds laid out for the patrons of the 64th floor restaurant. To her, it was just a nightly reminder of a world she served but could never touch. At 24, Oriana's life was a masterclass in deferment. Her dreams of textile design were locked away in a worn sketchbook she kept in her locker, its pages filled with intricate patterns and vibrant fabrics that felt a universe away from her starchy black uniform. Her meager paycheck, supplemented by the fickle generosity of strangers, evaporated before it ever hit her account. Most of it went to a sterile beige room in a long-term care facility, 2 towns over, where her mother, Catherine, was slowly being erased by early-onset Alzheimer's. The rest went to rent on a cramped apartment that always smelled faintly of her downstairs neighbor's curry. Tonight was a Tuesday, typically a slow, manageable night, but the maitre d', a perpetually stressed man named Jean-Pierre, had seated a last-minute 4-top in her section. "Be sharp, Oriana," he'd whispered, his French accent thickening with anxiety. "That's Miles Radcliffe." Oriana knew the name. Everyone in Westport did. Radcliffe wasn't just rich, he was the city's modern-day king, a tech mogul who had built a digital empire, Janus Corp, from his college dorm room. He was famously reclusive, notoriously demanding, and mythically wealthy. His face, sharp and severe, was usually only seen on the cover of business magazines. Seeing him in the flesh was like seeing a lion wander into a petting zoo. He radiated an unnerving stillness, a predatory calm that made the air around his table feel 10 degrees colder. He was with 3 other men in identical, brutally expensive suits. Their conversation was a low murmur of acronyms and market caps, a language as foreign to Oriana as Sanskrit. For the first hour, things were tense, but smooth. Oriana moved with the practiced efficiency of a seasoned waitress, her steps silent, her smile a polite, impenetrable mask. She refilled water glasses, cleared plates, and described the specials with a voice she hoped sounded serene, and not like someone who'd just spent her lunch break arguing with a health insurance representative on a payphone. The trouble began with the wine. Mr. Radcliffe had ordered a 2005 Chateau Margaux, a bottle whose price tag was equivalent to 3 months of Oriana's rent. She presented it with the reverence of a holy relic, her hand steady as she opened it. He waved a dismissive hand, not even looking up from his phone. "Just pour it." As she leaned over to pour the deep ruby liquid into his glass, one of the other men at the table shifted abruptly, his chair scraping back. The leg caught Oriana's heel. It was a tiny, insignificant stumble, a loss of balance for a fraction of a second. But in that fraction of a second, her hand tilted. A small, dark red splash, no bigger than a quarter, landed on the pristine white cuff of Miles Radcliffe's shirt. Silence fell over the table. A thick, suffocating silence. Oriana's heart hammered against her ribs. "Oh my God, Mr. Radcliffe, I am so sorry." she stammered, her professional mask cracking. She reached for a napkin, but he recoiled as if she were carrying a disease. He slowly, deliberately placed his phone face down on the table. He lifted his arm and stared at the red stain on his cuff as if it were a mortal wound. He didn't look at her. He spoke to the air in front of him, his voice low and cutting. "Do you have any idea how much this shirt costs?" he asked. It wasn't a real question. It was the opening blow. "Sir, I am truly sorry. It was an accident." He finally turned his gaze on her, and his eyes were like chips of granite, cold, hard, and lifeless. An accident is a product of incompetence. It's a failure to perform a simple designated task. Your task is to transport liquid from a bottle to a glass. You failed. The other men at the table shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting anywhere but at Oriana. The entire section of the restaurant had gone quiet. Diners at other tables were openly staring. Oriana could feel their pity and morbid curiosity like a physical weight. Her face burned with a shame so hot it felt like a fever. "I understand, sir. If you'll allow me, the restaurant will of course handle the dry cleaning." He let out a short, bark-like laugh. It was a sound utterly devoid of humor. "Dry cleaning? You think this is about laundry?" He leaned forward, and the civility of the room evaporated. "This is about a fundamental lack of awareness. It's about a person in a position of service who doesn't possess the requisite attention to detail to even be in that position." He looked her up and down, a slow, deliberate appraisal that made her feel like an insect under a microscope. "Look at you," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Tired eyes. Worn-out shoes. Going through the motions. This isn't a career for you, is it? This is just a placeholder. A way to pay the bills until... what? Until you get married, until some other mediocre opportunity presents itself." Tears pricked at Oriana's eyes, hot and treacherous. She willed them not to fall. She would not give him the satisfaction. She bit the inside of her cheek, tasting blood. "Sir, you have no right to speak to me that way," she said, her voice trembling but firm. His eyebrows shot up in mock surprise. "No right, I am the customer. I am paying for an experience your clumsiness and your attitude have just ruined. People like you," he said, gesturing vaguely to her, "exist to facilitate the lives of people like me. That is the simple, transactional nature of our society. When that transaction breaks down, what value do you have left?" He picked up the $1,000 bottle of wine. "This wine has value. It was cultivated, aged, and perfected over years. It has a purpose." He looked back at her, his lip curling into a sneer. "And what's your purpose to spill it?" That was it. The final killing blow. The dam broke. A single tear escaped and traced a hot path down her cheek. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, not satisfaction, but something darker, something unreadable before he turned away from her in disgust. "Get her out of my sight," he said to the air. "And send me your manager. I want her fired." Jean-Pierre was already rushing over his face, pale. He grabbed Oriana's arm gently. "Come with me, Oriana." "Now." She allowed herself to be led away, her feet moving mechanically. She didn't look back. She could feel the stares of every single person in that room on her back, 100 tiny needles of humiliation. As the kitchen door swung shut behind her, cutting off the opulent silence of the dining room and plunging her into the clatter and chaos of the kitchen, she finally let out a choked sob. Her co-worker, Cole, a lanky culinary student with kind eyes, met her by the dish pit. "Liv, what happened?" I heard shouting. She couldn't speak. She just shook her head, the shame and rage and helplessness churning in her stomach like acid. She fled to the staff locker room, a tiny windowless space that smelled of bleach and old shoes. She sank onto the bench, buried her face in her hands, and let the ugly, ragged sobs consume her. He hadn't just insulted her. He had peeled back her skin and laid bare all her deepest insecurities. The tired eyes from sleepless nights, worrying about her mother. The worn-out shoes she couldn't afford to replace. The feeling of being a placeholder in her own life. He had seen it all and used it as a weapon. Mrs. Dubois, the formidable owner of Le Ciel, found her there 10 minutes later. She was a stern woman in her 60s, but her expression was uncharacteristically soft. "I did not fire you, Oriana," she said quietly. Oriana looked up, her face blotchy and tear-streaked. "He demanded it." "He demanded many things," Mrs. Dubois said, her tone dry. "I told him you were one of my best and that accidents happen. He was displeased. He paid his bill and left. He did not even finish his wine." She paused, handing Oriana a tissue. "That man, he has a sickness in his soul. What he did to you was not about wine. It was about cruelty. Go home, Oriana. Cole can cover the rest of your shift. Take tomorrow off as well. Paid." The walk home through the cold Westport night was a blur. The city lights that had looked like diamonds from the 64th floor now seemed harsh and mocking. Every passing headlight felt like an accusation. Miles Radcliffe's words echoed in her head, a vicious, looping soundtrack. "People like you exist to facilitate the lives of people like me." "What value do you have left?" She reached her apartment, fumbled with the key, and collapsed onto her lumpy sofa without even turning on the lights. She curled into a ball, the phantom shame still burning on her skin. She had faced rude customers, condescending remarks, and outright propositions in her years of waitressing. But this was different. This was a violation. He had held a mirror up to her life and declared it worthless. And the most terrifying part was that in that dark, lonely apartment, a small, treacherous part of her believed him. She cried until she had no tears left, eventually falling into a fitful, dreamless sleep, the stain on a billionaire's cuff bleeding into the fabric of her own fragile self-worth. While Oriana slept, the sleep of the emotionally gutted Miles, Radcliffe sat in a sterile, white penthouse that overlooked the entire city. The apartment was less a home and more a monument to minimalist wealth. It was a vast expanse of polished concrete floors, glass walls, and furniture so artfully sparse it looked like it was afraid to touch the ground. There were no photographs, no clutter, no sign that a human being actually lived there. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling window, the same view Oriana had served under, but his was from the 90th floor. He had won. He was higher. Yet the city lights brought him no comfort. He held a crystal tumbler of scotch, the amber liquid catching the light. On the Italian marble table behind him sat his phone. It was the source of the poison that had seeped into his day, the reason for the grotesque spectacle at the restaurant. An hour before he'd left for dinner, he'd been on a video call with a woman in a white coat, Dr. Anya Sharma, one of the top neurologists in the country. Her face had been calm, compassionate, but her words had been a death sentence delivered in quiet, clinical terms. "The cognitive decline, the tremors you've been experiencing, the slight apraxia in your left hand," she'd said, her voice echoing in the silent penthouse. "The tests are conclusive, Miles. It's corticobasal degeneration, CBD." He knew what it was. He'd researched his symptoms for weeks. A rare, aggressive neurodegenerative disease. There was no treatment, no cure. It would be a relentless, progressive theft of his body and mind. First, the fine motor skills would go, then his walk. His speech would slur, become incomprehensible. His mind, the very engine of his empire, the thing he valued above all else, would become a prison. He would lose control, piece by agonizing piece. The prognosis was 5 to 7 years. 5 to 7 years of becoming a ghost in his own shell. There are therapies, Dr. Sharma had continued, to manage symptoms, to maintain quality of life for as long as possible. He had ended the call. He had sat there for a long time, staring at his own reflection in the blank screen of his phone. Miles Radcliffe, the titan, the visionary, the man who could bend markets to his will, had been brought to his knees by a handful of misfiring proteins in his brain. His empire, his billions, his power, all of it was utterly, pathetically useless against this insidious internal revolt. He went to the dinner meeting because it was on his schedule. His life was a fortress built of schedules and obligations. But inside, he was a king who had just learned his castle was made of sand and the tide was coming in. When the waitress he hadn't even bothered to learn her name had spilled the wine, it wasn't the stain that enraged him. It was the symbolism. The tiny, accidental loss of control. The blemish on a pristine surface. It was a microscopic echo of the chaos erupting inside his own body, and his reaction had been a desperate, horrifying projection of his own terror. People like you exist to facilitate the lives of people like me. He had said that. The words tasted like ash in his mouth now. He had looked at her simple, hard-working life, a life of physical tasks, of direct, tangible purpose. And in his panic, he had felt a surge of twisted, resentful envy. Her problems were money, a sick relative, a bad day at work. His problem was the complete and total annihilation of his being. So he had lashed out. He had taken his cosmic, untamable rage and focused its full power on this one fragile human being. He needed to feel powerful, in control of something, even if it was just her dignity. The memory of her face, the way her eyes had welled with tears, she fought to hold back the single tear that finally fell. It haunted him now. He hadn't felt satisfaction when he saw it. He had felt a sickening lurch of self-loathing. In her shocked, wounded expression, he had seen a reflection of his own monstrousness. He drained the scotch and poured another. The alcohol did nothing to numb the feeling. He walked through his silent, empty home. He had a staff he kept at a distance, a board of directors that feared him, and business associates who wanted something from him. He had no friends. His parents were long gone. And his sister? He flinched at the thought of Genevieve. They hadn't spoken in 8 years. Not since the buyout. He'd founded Janus Corp with her. She was the creative genius, the heart. He was the ruthless strategist, the brain. When a larger corporation tried to acquire them, she'd wanted to stay independent to protect their vision. He saw the path to $1 billion valuation. He had used legal loopholes and her trust against her, forcing a sale and pushing her out with a settlement that was generous by any standard, but an insult to her soul. He had chosen the empire over his only family. He'd told himself it was just business. Now, in this cavernous, silent penthouse, with a terminal diagnosis scrolling behind his eyes, he understood that he had amputated his own heart. He was utterly, completely alone. And then it happened. As he reached for the scotch bottle again, his left hand, the one Dr. Sharma had mentioned, refused to cooperate. His fingers, which could type 1,000 lines of code or sign a 10-figure deal, spasmed. The hand trembled violently, uncontrollably. The heavy crystal tumbler slipped from his grasp and shattered on the concrete floor, splashing scotch and shards of glass across the pristine surface. He stared down at his treacherous hand, horrified. He tried to command it to clench into a fist, but it only twitched a puppet with its strings cut. A wave of pure, unadulterated terror washed over him. It was real. It was starting. He staggered back, lost his footing, and fell. He landed hard on the floor, his hips screaming in protest. He lay there, a billionaire, sprawled on the floor of his palace, surrounded by shattered glass, reeking of alcohol, a prisoner in his own body. All the power, all the money, all the prestige, it was a joke. A grand, cosmic joke. He looked around the empty room at the cold art and the gleaming surfaces, and he had never felt so impoverished. He was going to die. And he was going to die a monster. He closed his eyes, and again he saw the waitress's face, her quiet dignity, the way she had stood her ground even as she was breaking. "So you have no right." She was right. He had no right. In that moment, his cruelty towards her became the defining act of his life. It was the perfect symbol of the man he had become, empty, cruel, and alone. A sob escaped his lips, a raw, ugly sound he hadn't made since he was a child. It was followed by another and another. Lying on the floor of his penthouse, Miles Radcliffe, the King of Westport, wept. He wept for his dying body, for his brilliant mind that would soon betray him, for the sister he had lost, and for the soul he had traded for a kingdom of glass and concrete. And strangely powerfully, he wept for the waitress, whose name he didn't even know. He had to fix it. It was a small, pathetic gesture in the face of his own oblivion, but it was the only thing he could think to do. It wouldn't save him, but it might be the only decent thing he did before the lights went out for good. Oriana woke to the insistent grey light of a Westport morning filtering through her thin curtains. Her head pounded, and her body ached with the psychic hangover of humiliation. For a blissful second, she didn't remember. Then the memory of Miles Radcliffe's face, his voice, the collective stare of the restaurant came crashing back. A fresh wave of nausea rolled over her. She dragged herself out of bed, her reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror, showing the damage. Her eyes were puffy, and red-rimmed her face pale. Radcliffe's words echoed in the small space. Tired eyes, worn-out shoes. She looked down at her bare feet on the cold linoleum. She had to go back to that restaurant. She had to put on the uniform and face the pitying looks of her co-workers. She had to pretend she wasn't shattered. As she was spooning instant coffee into a mug, a commotion started outside her building. It was a low rumble, an engine sound so deep and refined it was completely alien to her neighborhood of sputtering sedans and rattling hatchbacks. Curious, she peered through the blinds of her living room window. Her jaw dropped. Parked directly in front of her dilapidated 3-story apartment building was a car that looked like it had been teleported from another dimension. It was a Rolls-Royce Ghost, its body a gleaming liquid black, its chrome grille glittering like a royal diadem. It was so out of place it looked like a spaceship had landed. Neighbors were starting to peek out of their windows and gather on their stoops, pointing and whispering. Then she saw the man getting out of the driver's side. It was him. Miles Radcliffe. But this was not the man from the restaurant. The titan of industry was gone. In his place was a man who looked like he had been hollowed out from the inside. He wore the same expensive suit from the night before, but it was rumpled as if he'd slept in it. His hair was disheveled, and his face was pale and drawn. But it was his eyes that shocked her. They were red-rimmed and bloodshot, stripped of all their arrogance, and filled with a desperate, raw anguish. He looked broken. He saw her watching from the window, and his gaze held hers for a moment. He looked haunted. He walked to the front door of her building and buzzed. The sound jolted through Oriana's small apartment. She stood frozen, her heart pounding a frantic, terrified rhythm. What was this? Was he here to finish the job? To get her fired for good? To sue her? The buzzer sounded again, longer this time, more insistent. Her downstairs neighbor started yelling. Oriana, acting on an instinct she didn't understand, stumbled to the intercom. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice, a reedy whisper. A voice cracked and hoarse came through the speaker. It's Miles Radcliffe. I need to speak with you. Please." The word "please" sounded foreign and painful coming from him. Against her better judgment, she buzzed him in. She heard his heavy footsteps on the worn stairs. She unlatched her door but kept the chain on, opening it just a few inches. He stood there in the dimly lit hallway, and the sight of him was even more jarring up close. He looked smaller somehow. The aura of power had been replaced by a palpable aura of despair. He wasn't looking at her face. He was looking at the floor. He started, his voice thick with emotion. He had to stop and swallow hard. "I am sorry." Oriana stared at him through the crack in the door, speechless. "What I did last night," he continued, his voice trembling, "was unforgivable. It was monstrous. It had nothing to do with you and everything to do with me. It was a failing of my own character. A profound failing." He finally lifted his head, and Oriana was stunned to see that his eyes were swimming with tears. This man who had torn her apart with surgical cruelty was crying in the hallway of her apartment building. "There are no words. There are no excuses that matter," he said, his voice breaking. He held up his hand. In it was a single, impossibly heavy-looking car key with the iconic R logo. He also held a small folded piece of thick cream-colored stationery. "I don't expect you to understand," he choked out, "and I don't deserve your forgiveness." He shoved the key and the note through the crack in the door. They fell onto the floor inside her apartment with a soft thud. "I'm sorry," he whispered again, a raw, desperate sound. And then he turned and practically fled, his footsteps echoing down the stairs. Oriana stood there, her mind a complete blank. She heard the front door of the building open and close, and the low, powerful rumble of the Rolls-Royce as it pulled away. She slowly closed and locked her door, her hands shaking. She bent down and picked up the key and the note. The key felt cold and heavy in her palm, an artifact from a world she couldn't comprehend. She unfolded the note. The paper was exquisite, clearly expensive. On it, in messy, almost illegible handwriting, were just 2 words. "Forgive me." A knock on her door made her jump. It was Cole, her co-worker, holding a bag from their favorite cheap bakery. "Hey, Mrs. D gave me the day off too, so I thought I'd bring peace offerings," he said cheerfully. Then he saw her face. "Liv, you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." He peered past her shoulder. "What's that on the floor? Wait, is that a car key?" Oriana didn't answer. She opened the door wider and walked like a zombie to the window, pulling the blinds open. The spot where the Rolls-Royce had been was now empty, but its phantom presence lingered. All her neighbors were still outside, chattering excitedly. "Liv, what is going on?" Cole asked, his voice laced with concern. She held up the key and the note. "Miles Radcliffe was just here," she said, her voice numb. "He was crying. He gave me this. He said he was sorry." Cole stared at the key, then at the note, then back at Oriana. He let out a low whistle. "A Rolls-Royce ghost. As an apology." "That's not an apology, Liv. That's a psychotic gesture." He looked around the small, humble apartment. "What are you supposed to do with that park? It next to Mrs. Henderson's '98 Corolla. The insurance would be more than your rent." His practical words started to cut through her shock. He was right. It was insane. It wasn't a gift. It was a burden. A $500,000 monument to her humiliation parked on the street. "I can't accept this," she said, the resolve hardening in her voice. "I won't. This doesn't fix anything. It makes it worse. It's conscience money. He thinks he can just buy his way out of being a monster." "So what are you going to do?" Cole asked. Oriana looked from the key in her hand to the sketchbook of her designs sitting on her small desk. She thought of her mother, of the bills, of the crushing weight of her life, and she thought of Miles Radcliffe's face, stripped bare of everything but pain. Something had happened to that man, something far beyond a spilled glass of wine. Her anger from the night before was still there, a hot coal in her chest. But now it was mixed with a bewildering new emotion, a profound and unsettling curiosity. "I'm going to give it back to him," she said, her chin held high, "and I'm going to find out what the hell is really going on." The next morning, Oriana put on her armor. It was a simple black trouser and charcoal grey blouse ensemble, meticulously selected from her thrift store collection for its quiet statement of seriousness. In her pocket, the Rolls-Royce key was a cold, heavy weight, a piece of an alien planet she was determined to return to its origin. The bus ride downtown was a journey through worlds. It rumbled past her own neighborhood of brick walk-ups and bustling bodegas, carrying people with tired eyes and worn-out shoes, her people she thought with a pang of solidarity. Then it crossed an invisible threshold into the city's gleaming core, where the buildings became taller, the glass became cleaner, and the people moved with a sharp-edged purpose. Finally, it hissed to a stop before the monolith itself, Radcliffe Tower. It wasn't just a building. It was a declaration of power, a shard of black glass that tore a hole in the sky. Tilting her head back, Oriana felt a tremor of fear, a primal urge to turn and flee back to the familiar struggles of her own world. But then she felt the cold weight of the key in her pocket and remembered the stripped hollow look in Miles Radcliffe's eyes. This was no longer just about her humiliation. It was about the gaping wound he had revealed. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders and walked toward the glass doors. Stepping into the lobby was like entering a zero-gravity chamber. The noise of the city vanished, replaced by a reverent hush. The space was immense, a cathedral of white marble and steel, so vast and spotless, it felt like no human had ever actually touched anything. Sunlight refracted through the towering glass walls, cut sharp geometric patterns on the polished floor. At the far end, behind a desk that looked like a carved block of Arctic ice, sat a woman whose posture was as severe and flawless as the architecture around her. She was the gatekeeper. Oriana's sensible shoes made small, impertinent sounds on the marble as she approached. The woman looked up her gaze, sweeping over Oriana in a fraction of a second, cataloguing the inexpensive fabric of her blouse, the slight wear on her bag, and the determined, nervous set of her jaw. Her evaluation was complete. Oriana was not important. "Can I help you?" the receptionist asked, her voice cool and devoid of curiosity. "Yes, thank you. I need to see Mr. Miles Radcliffe." Oriana said, her own voice sounding small in the cavernous space. The woman's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was the smile of someone swatting away a fly. "Do you have an appointment, Miss Parker? Oriana Parker." "And no, I don't," Oriana admitted, feeling her resolve begin to fray under that icy gaze. "But it's a personal matter. It's very urgent. If you could just let him know that I'm here. Mr. Radcliffe does not accept unscheduled visitors," the woman whose nameplate read Ms. Albright stated flatly. It was the end of the conversation. She had already shifted her focus back to the glowing monitor on her desk, a dismissal more profound than any spoken word. Oriana stood frozen for a moment. This was the wall she had expected. the polite, impenetrable barrier designed to keep the world at bay. The old Oriana would have mumbled an apology and retreated in shame. But the old Oriana hadn't been systematically dismantled in front of a room full of strangers. The humiliation of that night had burned away her deference, leaving behind a core of something harder, something more resilient. She reached into her pocket, her fingers closing around the cold, heavy key. This was her only leverage, her only proof that she belonged in this alien world, if only for a moment. "I am here to return his property," Oriana said. Her voice was louder now, cutting through the sterile silence. She stepped forward and placed the Rolls-Royce key on the vast marble desk. It landed with a sharp, definitive clack, a sound of solid metal against stone that was impossible to ignore. Miss Albright's head snapped up. Her eyes, which had been dismissive moments before, now widened in alarm as they fixed on the iconic R logo. That key represented a level of access and power that she understood intimately. For it to be here in the hands of this ordinary-looking young woman was a breach in the natural order of her universe. The politeness vanished, replaced by a flicker of genuine panic. She snatched up her phone, her manicured finger jabbing at the buttons. She murmured into the receiver, her voice a low, urgent hum, her eyes never leaving Oriana. After a tense minute, she hung up her professional mask, back in place, but frayed at the edges. The dismissal was gone, replaced by a bewildered and grudging respect. "Mr. Radcliffe's executive assistant, Mr. Fields, will be down to meet you," she said, her voice a notch less arctic. "Please wait over there." She gestured with a flick of her wrist toward a set of austere leather couches that looked as if they had never been sat on. 20 minutes stretched into an eternity. Finally, the elevator doors slid open with a soft hiss, and a man in a perfectly tailored suit strode out. He looked to be in his late 40s with tired lines around his eyes and a palpable aura of stress. He was a man perpetually walking on eggshells. "Miss Parker," he said, his voice a practiced, smooth baritone. "I'm Robert Fields. Thank you for your patience." He glanced at the key still sitting on the desk, then back at her. "Mr. Radcliffe is indisposed today. However, he asked me to accept the key on his behalf and to express his gratitude by offering you this." He held out a slim black envelope made of heavy, expensive paper. It was clearly a check, a silent transactional solution to a messy human problem. A final attempt to buy his way out. Oriana looked at the envelope, then at Fields' weary face. She shook her head. "No, thank you, Mr. Fields. I'm not here for money. This whole thing started with me, and it needs to end with me. I have to give this back to him, in person." Fields let out a long, quiet sigh, the sound of a man whose entire job was managing the impossible. He subtly massaged his temples. "Ms. Parker, with all due respect, the entire office is on lockdown. My boss has cancelled meetings with finance ministers and board members. He hasn't left his penthouse office since the incident. He is unwell. He will not see you." "Did he fall?" Oriana asked. The question was a shot in the dark, an intuition born from the memory of Radcliffe's pained stiffness in her hallway. The question hit Fields like a physical jolt. His professional veneer cracked. I beg your pardon," he stammered, his eyes widening. He looked at her as if she were a mind reader, a ghost at the feast. How could you possibly know anything about that? He stopped himself, realizing his shock was a confirmation. "He just seemed like he was in pain," Oriana said, softly, pressing her advantage. "Look, I know this is irregular. But this isn't about the car, and it isn't about the money. It's about what happened at the restaurant. He came to my home seeking something, and I'm the only one who can give it to him. Closure." She met his gaze directly. "Please, Mr. Fields, 5 minutes. I won't raise my voice. I won't make a scene. I just need to say what I have to say to his face." Robert Fields stared at her, caught between the rigid protocols of his job and the undeniable strangeness of the situation. This waitress somehow knew things she shouldn't. She wasn't hysterical or demanding money. She was calm, centered, and impossibly persistent. Maybe he thought with a surge of desperation she was the solution to a problem he didn't know how to solve. Maybe she was the key. "All right," he said the word, tasting like a career-ending risk. 5 minutes. But I am coming with you to the door. And the second he wants you gone, you're gone. Understood. Understood. Oriana said, a wave of relief washing over her. The elevator ride was a silent, pressurized ascent to the summit of the world. Oriana's ears popped as they shot past 60, 70, 80 floors. The doors opened not into a hallway, but directly into the office itself. It was a breathtaking, terrifying space, a near-exact replica of his penthouse apartment, all glass and concrete, and cold, beautiful emptiness. And through the wall of windows, the entire city was laid out below them, like a map, the people and cars reduced to insignificant specks. Miles Radcliffe was standing with his back to them, staring down at his kingdom. Sir Field said, his voice barely a whisper. Ms. Parker was insistent. Miles didn't turn. His voice was flat, devoid of energy. "Leave us, Robert." Fields gave Oriana a final, wide-eyed look that screamed, "You are on your own," and backed into the elevator. The doors slid shut, sealing Oriana in the lion's den. The silence that descended was absolute, broken only by the faint hum of the building's circulation system. Oriana walked forward, her steps echoing in the vastness. She placed the key on the corner of his enormous, pristine desk. "I came to return this," she said, her voice holding steady, "and to tell you that I don't accept your apology." He turned around slowly. He looked worse, much worse. His skin had a greyish, almost translucent quality, and his eyes were sunk deep in their sockets. She noticed the tremor in his left hand was more pronounced today. He tried to still it by gripping his own wrist. "I didn't expect you to," he rasped. "An apology is supposed to be about remorse." Oriana continued finding strength in her own conviction. This she gestured to the key as a transaction. "It's you trying to put a price tag on what you did to make it neat and finished. You think you can throw $500,000 at your cruelty and call it even. My dignity, Mr. Radcliffe, is not a commodity you can buy back." Each word was a carefully aimed dart, and she saw them hit their mark. He didn't get angry. He didn't argue. He flinched, a subtle tightening around his eyes, and sank into his massive leather chair. He looked like a king who had just been checkmated, all the power draining out of him. He nodded, a gesture of complete surrender. "You're right." The fight she had prepared for dissipated into the sterile air. All that was left was the broken man in the chair. Her anger had been a shield, and without it, she was left with the raw, uncomfortable empathy she'd felt in her hallway. The question she had asked herself on the bus ride over slipped out quiet and sincere. "Are you okay?" The question undid him. His jaw tightened. His gaze dropped to his desk, to his trembling hand. He seemed to be fighting a war within himself, the lifelong conditioning to project strength, battling against a desperate, fundamental need to confess. He looked up at her, and his eyes were filled with a terrifying vulnerability. It was the look of a man completely and utterly alone. "No," he whispered, and the single word was a confession that shattered the glass fortress he had built around himself. "I'm not." The story came out of him, then not in a flood, but in broken pieces. He didn't give her the clinical name of his disease, but he spoke of a verdict delivered by a doctor, a hostile takeover of my own biology. He described the terrifying irony of it all. I spent 20 years building a perfect, infallible system. He said, his voice hoarse, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. A machine of pure logic, only to find out the vessel carrying the architect is defective. There's a clock, Ms. Parker, and I can hear it ticking in every bone of my body. He finally looked at her. That night, at the restaurant. I was a man who had just been told he was going to die, a slow, humiliating death. I was full of a rage so immense it had no target. And then you appeared. An accident, a flaw in the service, a tiny crack in the world's facade, and I aimed all of it at you. All the terror, all the powerlessness. It was a scream into the void, and you were just the person standing closest. It was monstrous. It was the act of a coward. Oriana stood there, listening the last vestiges of her personal anger dissolving into a wave of profound, heartbreaking pity. This wasn't a monster. This was a man in unimaginable pain, and his pain had overflowed and scalded her. "I'm sorry," she heard herself say, and the words were utterly genuine. "I am so sorry you're going through that." He looked at her, as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. Then his gaze drifted away toward a memory. "My sister," he said, the words emerging from a deep, locked place. "Genevieve, we started this whole thing together in a garage. She was the soul, I was the engine. When we got our first big acquisition offer, she wanted to refuse to protect what we'd built. I saw a path to all this." He gestured vaguely at the skyline. "I used her trust legal clauses she didn't understand. I forced her out. I broke her heart. And for 8 years I told myself it was the price of success. Now I see it was the price of my soul. She's the only family I have, and I have no idea where she is." He trailed off, lost in his regret. "She was the artist," he mumbled. "A designer. Textiles, fabrics. That was her world. Textiles, designer." The words hung in the air, clicking into place with other words from his pained monologue. Willow Creek. Jen and Oriana's heart began to hammer against her ribs. An idea so insane, so impossible, it felt like a hallucination started to form in her mind. What was her design style, she asked. Her voice hushed. Did she have a signature look Miles seemed to pull himself back from a great distance? Nature, he said. Always. The patterns on bark, the veins of a leaf, the way frost forms on a window. She loved willows. We grew up near a creek lined with weeping willows, Willow Creek weaves. Oriana's hands trembled as she pulled out her phone. Her thumb fumbled on the screen as she opened Instagram, her breath caught in her throat. She navigated to the profile she had spent hours admiring the work of the anonymous artisan who had inspired so many of her own sketches. She turned the phone around and held it out to him. The screen glowed with a grid of exquisite, complex fabrics. The profile name read Jen Parker, and the logo was a simple, elegant drawing of a weeping willow. Miles stared at the phone. He leaned forward, his face inches from the screen. He scrolled with a trembling finger, his breath catching. He stopped on one image, a close-up of a rich, textured fabric, woven with the intricate overlapping pattern of sycamore bark. This pattern, he whispered, his voice cracking. She sketched this in a notebook when we were 16. It was from the big sycamore in our parents' backyard. I used to tease her about it. He looked up from the phone, and the despair in his eyes was gone, replaced by a wild, desperate, electrifying hope. Jen, her middle name is Jeanette. She hated it. Everyone called her Jenny. But she sometimes called herself Jen. The air in the room crackled with the sheer impossibility of it. It was a 1 in a billion coincidence, a stitch in the fabric of the universe that made no sense at all. Oriana Parker, the waitress he had savaged, was the one person on Earth who held the map to his redemption. He rose from his chair, a new energy coursing through him. It wasn't the old arrogance. It was the galvanic spark of a drowning man who has just been thrown a rope. "Help me," he said, and it wasn't a request, it was a plea. "Help me find her Ms. Parker. Oriana, I can't just call her. I can't show up on her doorstep after 8 years of silence, not like this. But you're a designer. You understand her world. You speak her language. You can be the bridge." He was a deal-maker again, but this time he wasn't negotiating for market share. He was negotiating for his soul. "I will give you anything. The car is yours. The title is clean. I will pay off every cent of your mother's medical debt, past and future. I will set you up with your own design studio, space equipment, staff, anything you need. Consider it a commission. Your first project is to be my ambassador." Oriana looked at the staggering offer laid out before her. A new life, free from the crushing weight of debt and deferred dreams. And then she looked at Miles Radcliffe, the titan of industry stripped of all his power, making a final desperate plea for family, for forgiveness, for a peaceful end. She could see her future bright and shining, but she could also see his dark and closing in. The choice was not a choice at all. "Okay," Oriana said, her voice clear and strong in the silent glass-walled room. "I'll do it." She took a deep breath. "But not for the studio or the car or the money. I'll do it because no one should have to face the end alone." The story of Oriana Parker and Miles Radcliffe didn't end there. It was just the beginning. It wasn't about a waitress receiving a Rolls-Royce. It was about how a moment of profound cruelty, born from private despair, cracked open two worlds and forced an intersection. The car was never the point. It was just the clumsy, extravagant key that unlocked a door to something far more valuable, a second chance. A chance for Miles to confront the ghosts of his past before his future was taken from him, and a chance for Oriana to step out of the shadows of her life and into a future she had only ever dreamed of, not as a recipient of charity, but as an agent of grace. Their journey forward would be complicated, painful and uncertain, a testament to the fact that true redemption is never bought, but painstakingly earned, often with the help of the very people we have wronged the most. What do you think? Is forgiveness a gift? Or is it something that must be earned? Can one act of desperation change the course of a life? If this story of unexpected connection and redemption resonated with you, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share it with a friend who appreciates stories about the complex, messy, and beautiful nature of being human. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next real-life drama that delves into the depths of the human heart. Thank you for listening.